Saint Symmachus was the 51st Pope of the Catholic Church, reigning from 498 to 514. His pontificate unfolded in a turbulent era, marked by internal disputes within the Church and the growing meddling of the Byzantine Empire in Western ecclesiastical affairs. He was a pivotal figure in consolidating papal authority amid the political chaos of the 5th century. Symmachus was born in Sardinia, an island that formed part of the Western Roman Empire and was already feeling the influence of barbarian invaders. Although few details of his youth have survived, it is known that he was raised in the Christian faith from an early age in a devout family and was ordained a deacon in Rome, where he stood out for his pastoral zeal and intelligence. His name began to gain notoriety among the Roman clergy after the death of Pope Anastasius II in 498. The Church was deeply divided due to doctrinal disputes caused by monophysitism and the pressure of the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius I, who supported heretical currents. In this troubled scenario, the conclave to elect a new pope ended up generating a schism. On 22 November 498, Symmachus was elected by a majority of the Roman clergy, who recognized him as a defender of orthodoxy. However, an unsatisfied minority, inclined toward imperial and heretical influence, elected an anti-pope, the Archdeacon Lawrence. This triggered a grave internal crisis in the Church that would test Symmachus's spiritual and political authority. The simultaneous existence of two popes caused confusion among the faithful and fostered a climate of tension in Rome. To resolve the dispute, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled the Italian peninsula at the time, was called upon to intervene. Being a pagan, Theodoric sought only the stability of his kingdom and therefore decided to convene a synod in Ravenna to mediate the situation. At the Synod of Ravenna, Theodoric chose to support Symmachus, basing his decision on the fact that he had been the first elected, according to the practice of the Church of Rome. With this political support, Symmachus returned to Rome and was officially recognized as the legitimate pope. Nevertheless, the situation did not stabilize completely, and his adversaries continued to sow discord. From then on, Symmachus's pontificate was marked by a constant struggle to reaffirm his authority and to defend Catholic orthodoxy against heretical influences and supporters of the anti-pope. He had to face several councils convoked by his opponents, even in his absence, aimed at weakening his position and attributing false accusations to him. In 501, the enemies of Symmachus managed to organize a synod intending to judge him for invented crimes, such as misuse of church funds. The Pope refused to attend, since he considered that no one had authority over the successor of St. Peter. This attitude, though courageous, generated even more controversy among the bishops present. With the support of the faithful clergy and Orthodox bishops, Symmachus resisted the pressures and firmly upheld the papal authority as a divine gift granted by Christ. He reinforced the principle of the Pope's independence from civil power, a teaching that would be reaffirmed by many saints and theologians in the following centuries. During this crisis, Symmachus counted on the support of many monks, clerics, and Roman faithful who recognized in him a true shepherd amid the storms. Attempts to discredit him were numerous, but his integrity and firmness became signs of his fidelity to the apostolic mission entrusted to him. Even facing countless calumnies and persecutions, Saint Symmachus did not cease to fulfill his role as universal pastor. He strove to maintain communion with the churches of the West and worked for the unity of bishops who had been confused by the schism. His example of perseverance would become emblematic. In his pastoral administration, Symmachus was also a great benefactor of the churches of Rome. He ordered the construction and restoration of many basilicas and houses for the poor and pilgrims. Among his most notable works were significant repairs to the basilicas of St. Peter and St. John Lateran, symbols of Roman faith. Beyond sacred architecture, Saint Symmachus also cared for charity. He distributed alms to the poor, supported widows and orphans, and aided exiles. This witness of practical charity helped consolidate his prestige among the faithful, even in such troubled times. A striking trait of his personality was his humility. Even as a victim of defamation, he never allowed himself to be carried away by anger or vengeance. He always sought dialogue and reconciliation as a true imitator of Christ. His patience was a virtue that shone in the face of the harshest attacks. Doctrinally, Symmachus reiterated the fidelity of the Church of Rome to the faith of the apostles and to the ecumenical councils already recognized. He fought monophysitism and defended the divine and human nature of Christ, as proclaimed at the Council of Chalcedon. His doctrinal firmness inspired confidence in faithful Catholics. In his letters to the bishops, Pope Symmachus called for unity, peace, and obedience to the faith of the Church. With pastoral wisdom, he sought not to foster hatred against adversaries, but to correct errors with charity and truth. This conciliatory yet firm approach distinguished him from many leaders of his time. As the years passed, the situation in Rome gradually calmed. Anti-Pope Lawrence lost the political support he had and eventually withdrew from public life. Symmachus then could exercise his ministry with greater freedom, although he never stopped being vigilant against new threats to Christ's flock. The restoration of internal peace allowed Symmachus to turn his attention to other regions of Christendom. He sent aid to persecuted Christians in various provinces and maintained contact with bishops faithful to the gospel. His concern for the universal church was worthy of a true successor of Peter. The correspondence he maintained with other episcopal sees demonstrates his zeal for orthodoxy and communion. He did not accept doctrinal interference from the emperor or other bishops, reaffirming that Rome was the See of Peter, the visible foundation of the Church's unity. At the end of his life, Saint Symmachus was already regarded by many as a living saint. His fidelity to the mission received, his peaceful resistance, and his dedication to the poor and to the Church made him a symbol of Catholic fortitude against internal and external threats. During his pontificate, he faced not only internal divisions, but also external problems, such as the advance of heresies and conflicts between civil and religious authorities. His firm stance helped reinforce the doctrine of the Church's freedom in the face of temporal power. Symmachus understood profoundly that the Pope's mission is not to please men, but to guard the deposit of faith and lead the flock to salvation. This sense of responsibility and fear of God guided all his decisions, even the most difficult ones. The history of his pontificate is also a lesson on the value of perseverance. When everything seemed lost, he did not yield to pressures or threats. He trusted entirely in divine providence and acted as a shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. Saint Symmachus died on 19th July 514, after 16 years of pontificate. He was buried in the Basilica of St. Peter, and soon after his death, many began to venerate him as a defender of the true faith and the unity of the Church. The Church recognizes him as a saint, not for his political victories, but for his fidelity to the gospel in difficult times. His example remains alive as a model of courage, patience, and love for the truth. In the next parts of this video, we will learn even more about his spiritual legacy, his letters, and the lasting impact of his pontificate on the history of the Church. After consolidating his position as the legitimate pope, Saint Symmachus set about restoring not only external peace in the Church, but also the spiritual life of the faithful. In times of division, he understood that the conversion of hearts was essential to heal the wounds left by the schism that plagued Rome. Symmachus encouraged prayer, fasting, and penance as means to achieve the Church's unity. He saw communal prayer as a powerful instrument to dispel the darkness of heresy and human pride. For this reason, he constantly promoted solemn and devout liturgical celebrations. His zeal for the Roman liturgy also manifested itself in the organization of the ecclesiastical calendar and the promotion of the cult of martyrs. He supported the veneration of the saints' relics and encouraged the faithful to visit the tombs of the martyrs in the catacombs, keeping alive the memory of the faith that conquers the world. Among his reforms, the renewal of worship in some ancient churches stands out, especially those linked to the memory of Rome's first Christians. He understood that the Church's history was not merely a glorious past, but a living testimony of God's faithfulness. Disciplinarily, Saint Symmachus sought to reinforce the authority of the Bishop of Rome in the face of the tensions caused by the parallel councils organized by his opponents. He reaffirmed that the Pope, as the successor of Saint Peter, could not be judged by any human tribunal. This doctrine, known as prima sedes a nemina judicatur, the first see is judged by no one, was firmly defended by Symmachus against those who wished to subject him to unjust trials. This stance would inspire future popes and canonists throughout the Middle Ages. Even so, Symmachus was not an intransigent man. He knew how to listen to the advice of his most faithful collaborators, such as the presbyters who had supported him from the start and the bishops who recognized his election. His firmness was balanced by great humility. One of the greatest trials of his pontificate was the defamatory campaign against his person. Anonymous letters and false accusations were spread among the faithful and bishops to undermine his authority. Even so, he bore these injuries with evangelical patience. The resistance of Saint Symmachus recalls that of other great saints who were also unjustly accused, such as Saint Athanasius, who faced Arianism, or Saint John Chrysostom, exiled for defending the truth. In all these cases, fidelity to Christ was their strength. During these years of conflict, Pope Symmachus wrote several letters, many of which have been lost, but others were preserved, revealing his pastoral heart and doctrinal firmness. These texts remain valuable sources for understanding his theology and spirituality. In them, Symmachus always exhorted unity and fidelity to the Apostolic See. He clearly saw that without unity with the Pope, the Church would fragment and lose its identity. Therefore, he vehemently fought every attempt to relativize the role of the Bishop of Rome. Another notable aspect of his pastoral action was his attention to the Eastern churches. Although physically distant, Saint Symmachus kept correspondence with various bishops of the Byzantine Empire, seeking to maintain communion and warning against heresies that threatened the true faith. Even without direct influence over the Eastern Empire, Symmachus believed that Rome, as the center of apostolic faith, should exercise its role as mother and teacher, correcting errors and confirming the brothers in the faith, as Peter himself did in the Acts of the Apostles. This vision of unity, centered on truth and love for the Church, would be revisited centuries later by great popes such as Saint Gregory the Great, Saint Leo IX, and Saint Pius X. All of them recognized the importance of the mission that Saint Symmachus fulfilled in such difficult times. Saint Symmachus was also responsible for establishing norms that ensured the independence of papal elections from the pressure of nobles and secular authorities. With this, he anticipated reforms that would only be fully implemented later, such as the modern conclave. In his time, kings and emperors sought to interfere directly in the choice of popes. By resisting this practice, Symmachus reaffirmed the spiritual nature of the office of the successor of Peter. The Pope was not a state official, but the vicar of Christ on earth. By rebuilding churches and strengthening the faith of the people, Symmachus also testified to a living church which did not allow itself to be overcome by persecution or calumny. His actions showed that the power of the cross was stronger than any human intrigue. He understood that the Church's holiness does not depend on the absence of problems, but on fidelity to Christ amid storms. Therefore, he constantly sought to renew the faithful's hope, preaching the gospel with ardor, even in the darkest times. The spiritual life of Saint Symmachus was deeply rooted in prayer and meditation on the scriptures. It is said that he spent long periods in silence before the altar, asking the Holy Spirit for light to lead the Church according to God's will. His personal charity was also greatly admired. He himself visited the poor, the sick, and the pilgrims who arrived in Rome. He did not limit himself to delegating functions, but became directly involved with the suffering of God's people, like a true father. Many Christians saw in Symmachus a reflection of Christ's figure, silent before accusations, firm in the truth, generous with the needy, and full of love for those who persecuted him. He was indeed a shepherd after God's own heart. Over time, even some of his former opponents came to recognize his greatness and integrity. Although the schism was not completely erased during his life, Symmachus's figure contributed decisively to restoring confidence in the Church of Rome. Doctrinally, Symmachus proved vigilant. He allowed no concessions to the heresies that emerged or gained strength in the East, even when this implied diplomatic ruptures. For him, the purity of the faith was above any political calculation. The spiritual heritage of Saint Symmachus is that of a man who preferred to suffer persecution rather than betray the truth. A pope who understood that his mission was not to please the powerful, but to confirm his brothers in the faith received from the apostles and transmitted without alteration. In the next part of this script, we will explore the impact of his figure in the centuries that followed, his cult as a saint, later testimonies about his life, and how he is remembered by the Church's tradition as a model of a firm, faithful, and holy pastor. At the end of his pontificate, Saint Symmachus left a profound mark on the Church's history. His witness of fidelity in times of division consolidated the figure of the Pope as an unconditional defender of orthodoxy. He not only faced the schism, but also established important guidelines for the Church of the future. One of Saint Symmachus's great contributions was the defense of the principle that the Pope cannot be judged by human authorities. This doctrine would later be systematized by medieval theologians such as Saint Robert Bellarmine and reaffirmed at the First Vatican Council many centuries later. Symmachus's fidelity to the patrine office showed the world that the Pope's mission is not the result of political will, but of divine election. He was not intimidated by the pressures of the Ostrogothic king, nor by the threats of the dissident clergy. His loyalty was above all to Jesus Christ. Even with limited support from secular powers, Symmachus showed that the Church's strength lies not in armies, but in holiness and truth. This lesson remains relevant, especially in times of ideological persecutions and attempts to silence the Catholic faith's voice. The documents left by Saint Symmachus show a clear, direct style, full of authority. He wrote as one who knows he bears the weight of an apostolic mission. In his letters, we find exhortations to communion, discipline, and obedience to Catholic teaching. Many of his writings were used by subsequent popes to justify decisions in times of crisis. The doctrinal clarity of Saint Symmachus served as a beacon amid the darkness of heresies and political tensions. His memory became a source of security for the Catholics of the time. After his death, veneration of Saint Symmachus began spontaneously. The Roman people who had accompanied him in the most difficult moments soon began to visit his tomb and ask for his intercession. He was remembered as the Pope of Truth and the Father of the Poor. This popular devotion grew over the centuries, especially in the region of Rome. Many Christians considered Saint Symmachus an intercessor in times of division or when the Church faced external attacks. His figure was invoked in moments of trial. Centuries later, ecclesiastical writers such as Saint Gregory the Great cited Saint Symmachus as an example of firmness and fidelity. His figure was included in catalogues of local saints, although his canonization occurred before the formal process that would be established in the Middle Ages. In sacred art, Saint Symmachus is usually depicted in papal vestments with a serene expression, sometimes holding a cross or a model of a church, symbolizing his works in Rome. His countenance conveys peace and spiritual authority. During the Middle Ages, some monks composed hymns and litanies in his honor. His name appeared in votive masses celebrated in certain Italian dioceses, especially on occasions when the unity of the Church or the conversion of heretics was sought. A particularly notable element is that the life of Saint Symmachus was, for many monks and clerics, a true school of patience. He became a symbol of what it means to persevere even when enemies are numerous and justice is slow to appear. Later theologians reflected on Symmachus's example as a defender of the Church's freedom. He was seen as someone who anticipated the principle of the separation of temporal and spiritual affairs, always subordinating human power to divine authority. His struggle for the papacy's freedom inspired later movements of reform and resistance. Many 11th century canonists during the so-called Gregorian Reform invoked the writings and decisions of Saint Symmachus to combat lay investiture. This fact shows how his figure was not forgotten, but revered as a point of support for restoring the moral and spiritual authority of the Apostolic See. He became a cornerstone for the theology of Peter's primacy. Beyond his institutional legacy, Saint Symmachus is admired for his deeply evangelical spirit. He embodied Christ's words, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 5:10. Recalling his story, we see how holiness is not made of comfort or applause, but of endurance on the cross. Symmachus suffered greatly, was humiliated and attacked, yet remained faithful. This places him among the Church's great moral martyrs. Another precious aspect of his life is his practical charity. He was not content to preach doctrinal truth, but also cared for the poor, pilgrims, and the sick. He was a man of action, with his feet on the ground and his heart in heaven. This combination of doctrinal orthodoxy and concrete charity is a clear sign of true holiness. Saint Symmachus understood that truth without love can harden, but love without truth leads to error. He united the two masterfully. His actions also marked the relationship between clergy and people. At a time when clericalism was a temptation, Symmachus showed himself close to the faithful, celebrating with them, listening to their sorrows, and serving as a shepherd of souls. This pastoral stance was recognized even by bishops who had initially opposed him. Over time, the integrity of his life won hearts and disarmed resistance. He did not win by force, but by fidelity. Pope Symmachus teaches us that human recognition does not always come when we expect it. Many times, saints are only understood after their death. But God sees the heart's depths and exalts those who remain faithful to the end. In current times, when many question the Church's authority and there are internal divisions, the example of Saint Symmachus shines like a light. He shows that it is possible to be firm without being aggressive, faithful without being fanatical, patient without being complacent. His liturgical feast is celebrated on 19th of July, the date of his death. Although he is not one of the most popular saints, his memory remains alive in the Church's records and among the faithful who seek inspiration to withstand tribulations with courage. In the next and final part of this script, we will delve into the relevance of Saint Symmachus today, what he can teach the Church of our time, what spiritual lessons his life offers us, and how to invoke his intercession in periods of crisis and confusion. When we look at the life of Saint Symmachus today, we perceive that his story resounds powerfully amid the challenges faced by the contemporary Church. In times of internal divisions, attacks on faith, and doctrinal confusion, the testimony of a faithful and patient Pope becomes all the more necessary. The pontificate of Symmachus teaches us that fidelity to the gospel must prevail over any political, popular, or ideological pressure. He did not seek to please everyone, but was consistent with the truth, even when this made him the target of attacks and persecutions. In a world that values consensus above truth, Symmachus reminds us that the Church's mission is not to adapt to the fashions of the times, but to remain firm in what it received from Christ. The rock of Peter is not moldable. It is an immutable foundation. His refusal to submit to human judgments regarding his apostolic mission shows that the papacy, as a divine institution, is not subject to the whims of kings, emperors, or ideologies. This lesson remains current in the face of attempts to reduce the Church to a mere human organization. The humility of Saint Symmachus, even as a victim of defamation, teaches us not to seek revenge or sink into bitterness. He endured calumnies and falsehoods with Christian patience, trusting in God's justice and not in the world's applause. Another precious teaching of his life is unity. He never promoted schisms or encouraged divisions, even though he suffered because of anti-Pope Lawrence. On the contrary, he worked tirelessly for reconciliation and communion in the truth. In times when many want to adapt the Catholic faith to please ideological currents, Symmachus shows us that true charity lies in leading souls to the truth, not in confirming errors. Love for the truth was, for him, an expression of love for God and neighbor. His pastoral action reveals the balance between doctrine and charity. He corrected errors firmly, but also loved those who erred. Today's Church needs pastors with this same spirit, strong in faith and tender in caring for souls. Saint Symmachus also teaches us about the power of perseverance. He spent years being attacked, isolated, and discredited. Yet he did not abandon his mission. He continued celebrating, teaching, and serving even without the recognition he deserved. His unshakable faith is a model for laity and consecrated persons. In times of spiritual coldness, scandals, and persecutions, his example invites us not to give up, to remain firm in God's path, even when everything seems to be collapsing. In his silent prayer before God, Saint Symmachus found strength to endure all trials. He understood that a pope is, above all, a man of prayer. This deep spirituality should inspire all church leaders. His dedication to liturgy and the beauty of churches also speaks to us today. In a time when many despise sacred signs, he restored temples and promoted the sacredness of celebrations, nourishing the people's faith with reverence and splendor. The restoration of churches carried out by Symmachus is also a symbol of his mission to restore hearts. He knew that liturgical beauty leads to adoration, and that adoration is the center of Christian life. Therefore, he invested in building God's house. His generosity toward the poor also stands out in his life. He did not separate faith and charity. He understood that love for Christ must be manifested in concrete actions, especially toward those who suffer. His care for widows, orphans, and pilgrims is worthy of imitation. The Christian people of Rome recognized this holiness in life. Many saw in him a reflection of Christ the Shepherd. The Church, even divided, still perceived in him the light of a soul that sincerely sought God. This attracted hearts and dissolved resistance. The celebration of his feast on 19th of July is an annual opportunity to remember that the Church's saints are living models. Saint Symmachus is not merely a figure of the past, but a present intercessor who from heaven prays for the Church's unity. We should turn to him, especially when we see tensions and divisions within the Church itself. His example encourages us to be faithful to the legitimate Pope, not to be carried away by rumors and confusion, and to always pray for Catholic unity. In our daily prayers, we can ask, Saint Symmachus, defender of truth and guardian of unity, pray for us. His intercession is powerful, especially when we pray for the Church's pastors, for the bishops, and for the Holy Father. Saint Symmachus shows us that even in times of betrayal, calumny, and abandonment, God sustains his faithful servants. He did not allow the Church to be overcome by discord, for he found in Symmachus an instrument of peace, firmness, and restoration. For your channel's audience, this message is fundamental. There is no time in which the faithful do not need examples of courage and holiness. In Saint Symmachus, we have a pope who lived as a martyr of truth, even without shedding blood. In a digital world full of noise and polarization, the story of Saint Symmachus also warns us against false information, intrigues, and unsubstantiated accusations. He invites us always to seek the truth with charity and discernment. The life of Saint Symmachus is like a flame lit in the night. It shows that even when there is darkness, the light of Christ does not go out. And this light manifests itself especially in the saints who remain faithful to the gospel to the end. May today's Catholics, especially those who feel discouraged, wounded, or confused, find in Saint Symmachus the consolation of knowing that the Church has already gone through worse tribulations and emerged strengthened by God's grace. And may the Church's leaders, inspired by his figure, rediscover the value of doctrinal firmness, continuous prayer, pastoral charity, and courage in the face of persecutions. Saint Symmachus is a beacon for our times. We conclude this series with gratitude to God for having given the Church a shepherd like Saint Symmachus. May his life inspire us to love more deeply the truth, unity, and cross of Christ. And may he, from heaven, continue to guide Peter's bark to the safe harbor of eternity.